Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Come on in. Go to the chat. Tell us your name. Tell us where you're joining us from. So I am Lai Butaki, and I'm the Director of Communication and Outreach for Academia 2063. And I'm delighted to welcome you to session 9 of the Academia 2063 Ukraine Crisis webinar series. Today, we are going to discuss the transmission of global commodity price shocks to local commodity markets in Malawi. And as always, we are looking forward to a highly interactive discussion with you. So please do not sleep on this. Go to the chat, tell us your name, tell us your organization, where you're joining us from. And if you have any questions, any contributions, any observations during this conversation, please head to the Q&A. I repeat, head to the Q&A and drop your questions, and the moderator will bring them to the floor during this conversation. Of course, you are welcome to raise your hand if you wish to intervene live. If you raise your hand, the moderator will give you the floor and you'll be allowed to share your reflections with us in the course of this conversation. As always, we are providing simultaneous interpretation in English and French. Please click on the globe icon of your screen if you need translation in any of these languages. And as always, we are equally live streaming on our YouTube channel, Academia 2063. Join the conversation on Twitter. Our name handle is @Academia 2063. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, it is my pleasure to welcome the moderator of today's session. He is a friend of Academia 2063 and professor of economics at Cairo University. Please welcome Professor Shahir Zaki. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Lai. I'm very happy to be here today to moderate this webinar on the effect of the Ukrainian war and its effect on world prices. So we're very happy to have today Dr. Greenwell Machaya, who's a senior international researcher in economics at the International Water Management Institute. And this institute is a constituent member of the consultative group on international culture research. He's also a coordinator of the Regional Strategic Analysis and Knowledge Support System Program for Eastern and Southern Africa region, which is led by Academia 2063. So prior to joining the CGR group, Greenwell worked at the University of Reading, at the University of Leeds, both in the United Kingdom in the development field. And his research areas mainly focus on economics of development, including international agriculture trade, population and savings, public expenditure, a wide range of issues such as technology, policy adoption, impact, water, agriculture markets, and mutual accountability in development. So under the RESAC's SA program, Dr. Greenwell Machai is coordinating important efforts of various stakeholders, such as Academia 2063, IMWMI, African Union, SADC, etc., in order to strengthen the analytical capacities of SADC member states as one way of enhancing evidence-based agriculture policy planning and implementation. So he holds a PhD from the University of Leeds in the UK, and an MA in economics also from the University of Leeds, and an MSc in development economics from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences in Oslo. And he's an author of more than 40 peer-reviewed research papers and in international journals and book chapters. So an impressive CV. And we're very much looking forward to the presentation. So Dr. Greenwell will have 20 minutes to present his main findings, and then we will have some Q&As. And as Lai said, don't hesitate to raise your hand to unmute you or write your question in the Q&A part. So thank you so much, and over to you, Dr. Greenwell.
Yes, thank you very much, Shahil. Let me just project here. Thanks very much,
Shakir, as well as Lai, for the good introduction there. Yes, so today we're looking at the effect of the Russian-Ukraine crisis on commodity markets and focusing on Malawi. My presentation is going to go through an outline, introduction, objectives, methodology, results, and some key messages. So as a point of departure, let me say that whereas in most cases we tend to, we know already that things or conflicts that happen far away from our countries can have effects also in our countries as well as places beyond. In most cases, those effects appear not to be equal most often. So you find that a crisis is taking place in Europe. It has effects on Africa, Asia, Latin America, South America, etc. But those effects are going to depend on many other factors. Some of the effects can be very strong. They can last just a short period of time, but some of them can have long-term effects. So previous crises, I think, including the COVID-19, they stand as evidence of this. COVID-19 started with impacts in China as well as in European countries, but no sooner than sooner we started also seeing the impacts in Africa, and in some cases seeing a lot of havoc. So similarly, the Russia-Ukraine crisis that is just taking place, although it's taking place 10,000 or so kilometers away from most African countries, you find that it is likely also to have impacts on many other things in the African continent. For example, we know already that they are likely going to be trade disruptions because for war is something that you cannot control. So if they decide that they are not going to let, say, wheat or other commodities go through the ports of Ukraine, as well as some ports near Russian territories, then chances are that the effects of that are going to be felt to the neighboring countries. And this is also neighboring countries as well as beyond. But this is also compounded by the fact that these two warring countries are not just ordinary ones. They are significant players in international trade. For example, they account for about 27% of global wheat trade, and 23% as well as 14% of barley and maize trade, in that order. In terms of the pathways through which some of these might happen, the effects might be transmitted from the warring epicenters to countries far away from them, include one, the direct ones, whereby if a country trades directly with Russia and Ukraine, obviously the fact that these countries are fighting will mean they are not going to engage significantly in exports of trade if ports are closed, as I said already, and then the result will be a reduction in trade elsewhere. And if you're a country that were depending on importing directly from Russia, you're going to see scarcity of the commodity concerned in your country, and then leading to price increases. But secondly, also, if you're not directly importing from Russia, but probably you are, or Ukraine, but you import from a country that imports from Russia, then you can also be affected through that, because over time, the country that supplies you gets the supplies from Russia and they'll run out. But thirdly, even if you're distant in the trade network from them, so maybe you are far away from there, you don't import directly from them, you don't import from a country that imports from Russia, you might still be affected, because this is a crisis that is not hidden. Countries know that even if they don't trade with them, if they're getting fertilizers from somewhere, or if they're getting foodstuffs from somewhere, they might want to just hold their whatever they have in order to ensure that they see how the war plays out and how the impacts play out. So through those kind of linkages and probably many others, you might find that prices of commodities might start getting affected, not only near Russia and Ukraine, but also elsewhere, and elsewhere on the international scene. So this table is just changes in what prices of selected commodities. So for example, crude oil, when the war started in around February, there were some kind of changes in prices there. Maybe about, these are percentages, about 11%. So in any case, the total change over the period under study, which is between January and May 2022, was around 30% for crude oil, 12% for liquefied gas, about 23% for maize, for rice about 9%, for wheat about 36%, which makes sense given that these two countries also trade significantly in wheat, and for beef 1.9%, for sugar 6.8%, for sunflower oil 51%. I mean, makes sense as well, given that these countries are significant producers of these commodities. So now these are kind of changes which in general shows that there is an increase in prices over time in those kind of times of soon after the war. And the issue is that the increase in this might also be kind of transmitted into the other countries. So the concerned with the potential impact of these, then we set out to at academia research to start now and trying to see roughly to get hold of data and try to see whether these are also being reflected in the African continent. And so Malawi was one of the countries where we're focusing on. So the real objectives of this is just to analyze those price trends for selected commodities, draw insights that may be useful for limiting impacts of the crisis on livelihoods, as well as for directing kind of policy responses. The data used for this is from the Malawi Market Information Systems, some of it from the World Bank, some of it also from other internet sources, but the majority is from the Malawi Market Information Systems. And to do the analysis here, we kind of rely much on trends and try to kind of compare those trends with trends on the international market. The hypothesis being that if the trends on the international market are being dictated by part of the war, like I showed in table 1, if you also find that the trends at the country level appear to be mimicking the same, then chances are that there's also an influence of the war in that respect. But later also, when we kind of collected enough data, but it was soon after publishing this, we also started exploring other ways. So there were other ways for including difference estimates, as well as seasonal adjusted ARIMA models. And the results, of course, which we find are in corroboration to what we are going to describe in this, what is described in the brief concerned here. So in terms of the results, this is figure 1. So this figure 1, basically, it's just showing domestic and international wheat prices. This one is kind of just converted the international wheat prices to the local currency, and these ones are the local currency ones. I mean, in general, you can see that there's some kind of equal movement of these two series of prices, meaning that they seem to be driven by at least one third factor, or whatever is driving the world market price here seems also to be driving the local market. So here we're saying that prices rose dramatically after the week of 2 February, which is the period coinciding with the start of the war. And wheat prices also quickly increased in Malawi following the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war. This is perhaps not surprising, given that Ukraine accounted for about 72% of Malawi's wheat imports prior to the conflict. And the war also led to reduction in wheat supply from the two countries. The increase in prices, therefore, from February to around May, in Malawi for wheat flour, etc., was around 39%. If you tend to look at maize prices and you compare urban and rural markets, yeah, you see that there is, so the first thing maybe to say is that Malawi is kind of a net exporter of maize. Generally, it's at least maize self-sufficient. But even there, it's not every place where that maize is produced in sufficient quantities, except maybe for Lilongwe, Kasungu, Nzimba, Doa, and Nchinji districts. But other districts in the southern region, like Blantyre, these are kind of deficit areas where maize is not produced in sufficient quantities. If you look at the trends, you find that the trend for, so the blue one is Lunzu, the red one, okay, so now here I can see, just wait a minute. The red one is Mzimba, and then there's the green one, the Lilongwe, and the other one, the Nchinji prices. If you comparatively, maize prices increased more in the rural primary markets. So the rural primary markets are those ones which are not Lilongwe and not Luzu, than the urban centers, indicating that the rising domestic and external demand probably led to more pressure on the rural markets. And also at the same time, over the period of the study, the Agricultural Marketing Board, ADIMAC, in Malawi was discussing, was discussing deals to sell some of its maize to neighboring countries, including Zimbabwe. I think one of the deals they were negotiating that time was around 100,000 metric tons, which in essence might also have led to some prices rising there, or pressure rising. If you look at sugar prices, so sugar prices before the onset of the war, so all the way from the past, they were kind of almost flat with not a lot of changes. But after the war in 2022, you start seeing that the prices kind of changed significantly, rising in the first week of March, as well as continuing to even rise further in the after April. And if you also examine those, you start seeing that, sorry, I cannot see. You start seeing that in both rural and urban markets, prices changed patterns after the 5th week of March, rising from just as low as 940 kwacha per kilogram in Zimba and Nchinji to above 1,300 per kilogram. So some of these increases appear to be related to what was happening on the international stage, because there was nothing else which might have happened in Malawi. I mean, otherwise it would have been written about. The only thing that they were experiencing, which might explain the tremendous change in the prices, could be the Ukraine-Russia war. The rural areas, so I'm trying to say now, what would be the explanation for the prices to be slightly lower in the urban centers? Probably it would be the fact that in the urban centers, that's also where transport infrastructure is not as bad compared to the rural areas. And if there is so much demand for sugar now, for one reason or another, I think over this period of time, other countries were already saying they were going to ban sugar exports. So if a country wanted to trade much, maybe they would want to take advantage of international prices, and they would want to avoid places where maybe marketing would be difficult, for example, in the rural areas. Just a minute. If you come to the rice and millet, you also find that there were some changes, like a bit chaotic changes, in the sense that in different markets, the changes were in different directions. But I think apart from the one market here, the one for Nchinji, all the other markets, you can see that there's kind of an upward trend after after the third week of March. The prices were generally rising, and comparatively, millet prices in Mchinji declined significantly from 900 to about 450, almost 50%. Whereas in the others, there was kind of an increase in the prices of the same. So while this one is an odd one out and might be explained by the fact that that was also closer to the harvesting season for millet, but I think the rise in the prices in the other markets might be also due to the pressure on the markets. On the market due to the war. The cooking oil. So cooking oil is one of the commodities that you would expect significant impact because Ukraine and Russia account for almost 75% of sunflower oils there, or production. And the war might mean that their share will not be available on the market, and then traders are going to see that, take advantage and start selling at prices that are significantly high. So in Malawi, I think what happened is that at first you see the prices in the, say in Luzu market. Luzu is in Blantyre, it's like an urban market. And then the other one is market in Mzimba, which is slightly rural kind of market. So the rural market seems to be lower at first. They seem to be experiencing lower prices compared to the urban centers, where probably demand is generally higher for cooking oil. But then what is interesting is that after February, this third week of February, you start seeing prices rising from the around maybe to just above 2,500 to rising above 300 all the way to 3,500, and then they stabilize. So now, but the stabilization and almost like the equality in terms of the series here is coming because I understand that at that time, when prices were increasing uncontrollably, there was a discussion in the parliament in Malawi, and they discussed that they decided that they were going to subsidize, to kind of put a halt to a cap to how much this was going to rise, but also subsidize. But I think that subsidy just came in form of removing value-added tax or some one of the taxes from oil at that time. So that explains why there's kind of uniformity in the prices here, while there wasn't a uniformity of prices in the two markets just before then. And then when it comes to the energy prices, so the energy prices, there's not much variation in energy prices because also these are set, they're regulated by the MERA, the Malawi Energy Regulatory Authority. But one thing that we can still see here is that the prices for gas, for petrol, and for diesel, at first they were kind of stable and almost just not changing, but they started kind of change. They kind of changed after the fourth week of March. So there was an increase in the prices. This, I think, might also have been the pressure, because otherwise, given that it was becoming difficult to import fuels from outside as the war started, it was going to become likely not worthwhile in terms of businesses. So they had to kind of increase prices. So this change, again, we're interpreting it as a result of the war. The changes were not like the same; they were different from between the if you compare the gas, petrol, and diesel prices. So these increases were about 30% for diesel, more than 38% for gas, and more than 19% for petrol. If you now look at this summary, because there's a lot of things being presented here, but in terms of the summary, so we compare the global price changes on this part, and then I'll also present the change in local rural market prices, as well as the change in urban markets. Just took some of the markets. You see that for maize, the global percentage change in prices over that period under study was about 23%. In Malawi, for the same period, for a rural market in Chinji was around 34%, 35%. For the urban market of Lunzu, it was kind of almost zero or negative, just 0.61 negative, almost no change there. For wheat, the change was about 36%, almost similar to the change of 37.5% in the rural market of Nchinji, and again 37.5% for Lunzu. For sugar, the international market, I think there was a smaller change compared to the changes within Malawi. There were significant changes in Malawi, 38%, 28%, which might be because Malawi produces sugar and they might have been trying to take advantage of the international markets and increasing prices. And for rice, at the international scene, the total change over the study period was about 9.7%, whereas for Nchinji, it was about 31.8%, and for Lunzu, it was about 32.4%. Again, a significant increase there. For cooking oils, 51% on the international scene, on the international market, about 31% in rural areas, as well as 26% in the urban centers. And for beef, almost a small change on the international market, but about 10% in Chinji and 45% in urban centers. For fuel, 30% changes here, but you also see that the changes for diesel in Malawi at least is comparable to the change in crude oil on the international market, and liquefied gas, the changes were slightly higher than the changes on the international market. But I think although these figures are saying one thing, there seems to be kind of a commensurate change, sometimes higher on the local markets in Malawi. But we also tend to explain these, we tend to kind of attribute some of these changes to the changes on the international market. And then if you also try to sum up several markets and try to see which markets now will experiencing negative changes as well as positive changes over the study period. So trying to look at to compare the comparing the rural markets versus the urban centers. Interestingly, the rural markets appear to be experiencing significant rising prices very fast, and compared to the urban centers. So one would say that if there's a differential impact of the Ukraine war or Ukraine-Russia crisis, it is such that the rural areas in Malawi suffer even more, which is something that can also be expected given that they tend to be the ones where the poor kind of live. And I think from the policy perspective, that is something that is useful to know, because then you can target interventions similarly. So saying prices of all commodities in rural markets also generally increased, and overall prices rose faster in rural markets compared to urban markets. In comparison, urban markets experienced an increase of slightly 40% in February and 85% in March, followed by 70% in April and May. So this is just the same graph. But by the end of May, the number of markets with rising prices declined of under 70% in urban markets, while close to 92% of rural markets were still experiencing rising prices. So still underscoring the fact that in rural areas, the impact was kind of a bit significant. So here, we did also get hold of further data, but that was later after publishing the brief. What is interesting here is that the conclusions, at least with respect to many series, although here I'm just presenting two for two markets. But
Dr. Greenwell, would you please conclude in like 2 minutes to have time for discussion?
Okay, so these graphs, these two graphs are basically showing predicted prices as well as, so the predicted prices are prices which should have obtained if there was no crisis, the Russia-Ukraine prices, whereas the other series are just the observed ones. So if you see the predicted prices, the models that we have used here predict that prices were going to be lower, but the observed ones, you can see already by the blue ones that they were higher than the predicted ones, which also confirms that there was an effect of the war on prices. So in essence, the Russia-Ukraine war presents a challenge for global food security and household resilience. The trends, for wheat and vegetable oils, this increase in prices was expected in Malawi because Malawi.
I'm sorry, Greenwell. It seems your slides are not moving. Are they moving on your end?
Yes, they are moving. On which one are you? Which one are you seeing there?
The one of figure 6.
Figure 6.
So you're seeing only this one, the figure 6? You were not able to see table 2?
No.
No.
Maybe you can stop sharing and try again.
Okay, let me just stop sharing. Can you see table 2?
Yes.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Can you see, so we have already discussed this. Can you see table 7, which is summing up all the markets, and it's showing that rural markets have rising prices,
yes,
and urban
can.
markets, we have discussed this one. And
yes.
Then I came to this one. This is predicted versus observed prices in urban versus rural markets. Can you see something there?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is the one using econometric methods to try and confirm that, to solidify this hypothesis that the Russian war had an effect on the price movements. So the predicted ones being the red ones, the blue ones being the ones that we observe. So you can see that the ones that we observe deviated from what would have been predicted if there was no crisis. So this, I think I also talked about that. And now I also came to the key messages. Are you able to see that? This one?
Yes.
Okay. So in general, we're saying that the key, in terms of the key messages, I think I can summarize by saying that this Ukraine crisis has led to impacts of, in terms of prices, for commodities, even in places that are far away from Ukraine. And we can see that for Malawi, wheat prices were affected a lot, but even maize prices were affected, and indeed even the other commodities that we have kind of talked about. So given this, it is important that the country, or not just Malawi, but in this case, Malawi, it is important that when crises like this take place, in order to design appropriate interventions, it's important to rely on studies so that you know where you're having significant impacts or what kind of impact are you having, because these impacts can differ from urban centers to rural centers, from markets, etc. So for appropriate design of interventions, it's important to have that kind of information. I think in other implications also are that it would be useful to improve investments into the agriculture sector, knowing fully well that if this war continues, then the scarcity that we're seeing now is going to even continue next time. So it's better to kind of be prepared, maybe invest more in openness, trade openness, of course, as well as in production. So maybe with that, I've come to the end of this. Over to you, Shaki.
Thank you, Greenwell. So now we can start have the discussion and the Q&As from the floor. So don't hesitate to raise your hand, to unmute you, or to send us your questions in the Q&A chat box. We can start with that. There is one comment from Martin Fowler. This is all very interesting, but things must now be very different. Will you be discussing how the prices of these commodities have tracked over the past 8 months? Any stabilization reversion over the medium term would be useful to hear about. So, Greenwell.
Yes, that's very important. So if you look at the, let me just maybe go to this other figure which you didn't see properly. If we take this one. Can you?
Now we see the last slide.
The last slide, okay. Okay, it says it's, but I did show, I wonder why it's not shown, but I did show here I was displaying the slide that I showed. So the prices have not stabilized. That's basically the message that we're getting from one of the figures that I showed there. So the previous ones showed that there was an increase in prices over time, but unfortunately, those increases, have continued. So for example, while by around 2022, around 2020, the early times, the prices were, say, I would take for maize, maybe when around 900 or something, 1,000. Now they even went as far as 400 in some places, meaning that prices continue to kind of increase there. So I think the implications that we drew from that series using, that brief using a shorter series of data that we examined, we cannot deviate from them. In fact, the data now even shows that this is increasing. So if there is anyone wanting to do more to help those countries, it's better to even do it now. The case for helping or for doing something has not weakened.
Okay. Thank you, Greenwell. Other questions? I think that there are two other questions. One other question in the chat box. From Paul Gutiga. Thanks, Greenwell, for a nice presentation. Could you expand on the reasons why prices in rural markets were rising higher than those in urban areas?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, basically. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. The way I look at it is that so let's take, for example, the price of maize. The price of maize in the rural areas. Once it is known that there's war and some markets maybe some countries are hoarding whatever they have. If you are an aggregator, you're likely going to start hunting for maize wherever it is, and maize is produced in the rural areas. So maybe these are places where there will be more pressure in terms of prices because everyone else wants to go there, mop up what is there, keep it in town, ready to sell later. That's what I would just think about, because otherwise, yeah, it was just, when I saw it, I was kind of puzzled, but I'm just thinking it could be a question of aggregators trying to take advantage of the moment to get as much access as possible to what is the supplies that are there, and they're usually in the rural areas, bring them to town, and later they can sell them elsewhere. Over to you.
Thank you, Greenwell. Still no other questions. Any questions from the floor? So there is first Mahamadou. I can't see the rest of the names. So Mahamadou Tankari and Julie Collins who have some questions. So would you please unmute Mahamadou? Mahamadou, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moderator. And thank you, Greenwell, for the presentation. I have one question related to the price differential between urban and rural. So I'm wondering if before the crisis, there wasn't this price gap between the urban and rural, because I think it might be good to know, or at least show what was the situation before the crisis. Was there, for example, a price gap or price differential between urban and rural before the crisis or not? Or is it higher currently or not? So I think this can help to really know if the crisis has impacted the prices in a rural area compared to urban. I'm also wondering if you explore some effect of some variable like exchange rate. We all know that during the same year, for example, some international currencies like dollar has strengthened. So in your analysis, is it possible to attribute some effect to this exchange rate effect? So I would like to hear from you. I know that it's difficult to find a counterfactual, but one suggestion for this analysis, I think, is it will be good to compare, at least to provide the evolution of prices during the crisis compared to 1 year before the crisis. So just it's not a good counterfactual, but it can help us to see how the price movement and also the price gap, for example, between the urban and the rural. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahamadou. Perhaps we can get some questions, the rest of the questions from Amino and Julie, and then you answer all of them, Greenwell, for the sake of time.
Okay, not a problem.
So, Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Shahir, and thank you, Greenwell, for the presentation. I just wanted to ask if you can say a little bit more about rising prices for the commodities for which Malawi is an exporter, like maize and sugar. I think you mentioned maize exports to Zimbabwe. Do we know much about how Malawi's maize exports behaved in general? Did they rise in 2022 compared to other years? And similarly for the sugar, if you could just say a little bit more about why those commodity prices were increasing too. Thank you.
Okay.
And the final question from Aminu.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank Greenwell for this excellent presentation. I really enjoy it. So I have very few points. In your ARIMA model and the analysis, what is the span of the data that you use? Because we know that naturally there is kind of price fluctuation, and here it may be good to see a kind of multi-year data in order to justify the prediction that you are doing here. And related to that, how were you able to distinguish the effect of COVID? Because this is also another crisis, and we are not yet finished with the COVID situation, so we cannot really say that everything that is happening now is only related to the Ukraine crisis, because we know that the COVID effect was there. So the last point on which you may think, I think we have the effect on price, but what you may be interested also is to see the effect on the welfare, because we know the local traders are also try sometime to take the opportunity of high import price to increase their own price. So, and then you may see how what is the total effect in terms of welfare for consumer and also for traders. Thank you.
Thank you, Aminu. So perhaps I will just add 2 questions to these because they are a bit related, Greenwell.
Okay.
So again, I reiterate what my colleagues have just said. It's very informative, and the results are very relevant, and I think they also can be generalized on other African countries that have been hit by the Ukrainian war. And my 2 questions are, so the first one would be more related to the trade policy of Malawi. So to what extent trade policy of Malawi in terms of tariffs and non-tariff measures during or after, during the war, amplified these developments? So did the government impose any kind of export bans or further non-tariff measures that made the crisis stronger? That's on the one hand, and on the other, I think also the question of the exchange rate is very interesting because I was for instance, in the Egyptian case, the pass-through that we observed was very, very strong, and we have just had a currency devaluation a month ago, and it was a very strong currency devaluation. So I was wondering how the exchange rate policy has been managed in Malawi during this period. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Sheku, and everybody. These are very interesting questions. So maybe let me start approaching them, tackling them from the first one. So from Tankali, I think, and it's also related to others, but I will still respond to each and every question. So for the differential between the urban and rural crisis, and you rightly suggest that it would be useful also to look at price trends before the crisis versus after the crisis. And you also asked about the exchange rate. So indeed, in the data, we are able to see the trends from the past as well as from the present. In some cases, what is happening is not necessarily that maybe, okay, in some, depending on the market, you find that in some cases, there is a change. The market, which was experiencing higher prices, seems now to be experiencing lower prices. In some cases, it's just showing that, okay, while the differences were small at first, after the crisis, the differences are higher, with the urban ones being lower than the rural ones. Now, the implication of this is that, okay, if you don't do much of the analysis, you might tend to kind of conclude too quickly about what you think is happening. However, I was kind of cognizant of that fact. So one of the things I wanted to show you, but I thought, okay, you're not seeing other graphs. It's differences in differences, which you also you kind of suggested. So if you look at another way to confirm what we're seeing from the Sarima model here, is we kind of computed the differences from month to month over the period under study for 2022 and compare it with 2021, the year before, and try to see which ones, and try to get the difference of those differences. If you look at that, you find that the 2022 one experienced more changes. So if you do that, at least you can say to some extent that, okay, you have controlled for some things here because you're looking at differences across months and differences across the differences. So even with using the differences in differences, you still come to the same conclusion that there was in 2022 appeared to have prices that changed in very different ways than the year before. And I wonder whether the exchange rate one, in this case, is not taken into account when you approach it from the differences in differences one, because through making those differences, you might be partially out a part of the exchange rate change, the changes in the exchange rate. But I have to say, indeed, which is similar to Professor Shahi's question, over the period under study, there was kind of, especially when you consider the data all the way to December, there was a period where the government, the central bank, announced a devaluation of the currency to relative to the dollar. I did not take into account for some of those graphs in the kind of calculations of things, but when you look at the differences as well as when you look at the ARIMA model results, you start seeing that okay, the chances are that the conclusions we have might not necessarily be changed by that. And then the rising exports for the commodities, I think this is Julie's question. So you're asking, I think the question was about what is driving the rise in prices for the exported commodities like maize and sugar. So I think what I think, what I opine is that because countries want to take advantage of kind of scarcity in some cases, or not countries, but companies. So the Ilovo Sugar Corporation, they maybe might be thinking, okay, there's a lot of demand out there. It is important for us to kind of increase prices, and after all, we're also going to sell outside the country. So maybe there was demand, they wanted to sell more, because I think over the same period, India, is it Argentina, Brazil, and other countries, including maybe Egypt, they had banned a number of things, including export of vegetable oils, export of is it sugar, and other things. So other commodities. So countries that wanted to fill that gap needed to just raise the price, because why not? So that's what I'm thinking. Another explanation definitely might be plausible as well, but this is what I kind of can come up with now. The other question was from Aminu. So the data spans kind of for some of the commodities, they span from 2003 all the way to 2022. For some of them, they span from 2015 all the way to now. But in any case, for the ARIMA models that we can we fit, the data points are at least 70. Now, statistically, yes, these are data demanding, but I think it's not uncommon to see results being conclusions being drawn from such kind of samples, even if you draw from the origins of these methodologies from Box, Jenkins, etc., etc. And the distinguish the effect of the COVID, etc. So yeah, that's very true, because there's not one crisis at a time. So we think that in terms of one way, I had that in mind. So the other model formulations where you say, okay, let's try to calibrate the model with data that spans from wherever it begins all the way to 2021. So what that does is that, yes, it does not take into account, it does not completely make COVID irrelevant, but it at least gets the information of the COVID impact that was generated in 2020 to 2021 into the model calibrations. And then you use that as if it is the norm now to now look at 2022. When you do that, you have still, at least to some extent, taken into account the fact that there was COVID. It is part of the information in the model, in the model that you estimated, and whose parameters you've used to forecast the 2022 period. But having said that, one would not necessarily say that then the effects have completely gone. So chances are that what we're seeing are first and foremost part of the Russia crisis, and maybe to some minor extent also the COVID crisis. It would have been different if we did not include 2020 in the estimation of the model first before we do the predictions. Because in that case, we'll be ignoring COVID. And then, yeah, I think for Shakil, you're talking about trade policy. So for trade policy, the one thing that happened, I think, in Malawi over that period of time is that there was a kind of removal of, say, value-added tax on import, some taxes on imports. So which was like a relaxation of things. If you can see, this is like opening up to say, okay, maybe instead of us shutting down, let's try to open up so that prices can go down. And indeed, that's how they stabilized some of those prices. but there was no outright. I was expecting that they were going to ban. Okay, so later the deal to sell maize to Zimbabwe, later it failed. That's what I got. So some say it still took place, but some say that it did not take place. So I think it's possible that there was a ban on that maize trade, but it was not an it's not something that you can just see that they said, okay, no, don't export any maize, because I think a lot of other traders continued to export maize, but the Agricultural Marketing Board did not sell the massive amount of maize they wanted to sell to Zimbabwe. And the exchange rate question, yeah, they devalued the currency at some point during the period of 2022. Yeah, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So I think there is one final question, given that we still have 4 minutes. So it's a question from Wondwosen. Thanks for the nice presentation. Does Malawi has the potential to domestically produce towards self-sufficiency in wheat? If so, is there a policy direction towards improving local? Just a second, because I can see the rest.
To withstand such and other shocks in the future.
Yes, so to local production to withstand such and other shocks in the future.
I think that's a very good question, because I think that's also one of the issues I was thinking about, even when we write the other in the other briefs. There is definitely wheat can be produced in some parts of Malawi, but whether they can try to just produce everything and run away from international crisis, that's another issue, because now you need also to compare to think about the competitiveness of whatever you do. Since you produce this with scarce resources, you need to be able to see where your resources can make a lot of sense. Having said that, I think there is some extent to which they can still produce something. They would have to look at the varieties of wheat, maybe the ones that are available in South Africa or elsewhere. They have to try them and still drive towards meeting some of the demand from domestic production. But I wouldn't necessarily expect that they should produce everything, because then how many things are they going to produce, since the effect is on many other things. But yes, I think that's something they would need to try and do in order to make sure that when these crises come, they don't completely find themselves completely helpless, because we have also seen the weaknesses in over relying on global value chains in this crisis.
Perfect. Thank you, Greenwell, so much. It was very informative, very rich, and extremely policy relevant. So we're perfectly on time. We still have just less than 1 minute. So thank you once again for inviting me to moderate this session. And over to you, Lai, to conclude.
Thank you very much, Shahir, for agreeing to moderate this session. And thank you to our speaker, Dr. Greenwell Machaya. Thank you to all our attendees. Thank you for being so engaging during this session. We're always glad to have you here, and don't miss next week, same time next week for session 10. And we will be discussing the impacts on local markets in Kenya with Dr. Paul Maina Guthiga. Please go to the chat and click on our slide share to get access to all the PowerPoint presentations from this webinar series. And of course, visit our Ukraine crisis portal on academia2063.org to see the 20-something briefs we have published so far, 23 and counting. Thank you all. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, and we hope to see you back here next week. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you, Shahil. Thank you, Lai. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, and thank you.